Today we're here together, and I really thank you. We all thank you greatly for being here to remember and celebrate, critique and analyze. After the mass killing of 1 million to 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman government in 1915, and during which time another 1 million to 1.5 million Greeks and Pontic Greeks and Assyrian Christians were also killed. After the destruction of about 2,500 Armenian churches and monasteries, about 1,990 schools, the destruction of the movable and immovable property and material culture and commercial institutions of more than 2 million Armenians living in Turkey then. After that, Armenian literature survives. Armenians are small in numbers, relatively speaking, but deep in history and culture. I say small in numbers, maybe 8 to 9 million in the world today. But their literature, both in Armenian and in various languages of Armenian diasporan life, is a vital force, an inventive imaginary, a cultural project of enduring value. After the ruin, the texts remain. The Armenian literary tradition is about 2,000 years old, 1,700 years old in its own language. Genocide didn't extinguish this glue force. The words and texts, the song of rhythmic language, music, the speech, tongue, voice, syntax, the fierce blade of truth-making, the alembic of insight, the kinetics of literary knowledge. That stuff was not extinguished. A whole generation of Armenian writers and intellectuals were cut down by the Turkish government in 1915 in a systematic process of arrest, deportation, imprisonment, and murder. And yet, most of their work survives. The books weren't killed. Although a whole generation of writers were silenced, just as that generation was coming into its maturity, and that's a loss that's hard to calculate. And it reminds us, perhaps, of why Raphael Lemkin, who developed the concept of genocide as an international crime, placed such importance on the destruction of culture as a component of genocide. Tonight we have an extraordinary group of minds: Eric Bogosian, Nancy Krikorian, Maureen Freely, Ronald Suni, Ragip Sarakalu, Robert J. Lifton. You have their bios on the program, so I don't need to read them. But we have a kind of jazz sextet here. So you're going to witness the cues in process as we do our thing. And as I say, we will be talking about the issues surrounding and emanating from the 1915 killing of the Armenian intellectuals. I plan to ask our panelists some questions, and we are also going to read some segments. So let me start with a segment from the memoir by, and I need to go to my computer here. That's an image, but let me go to Grigori Balakian. Yes, he's a relative. He's our great uncle, my grandmother's uncle, my grandfather's cousin. He wrote a memoir, Armenian Golgotha. He was arrested on the night of April 24, and he survived. His memoir tells an extraordinary story of his survival. This is a short excerpt remembering the night of the arrests. On the night of Saturday, April 24, 1915, the Armenians of the capital city, exhausted from the Easter celebrations that had come to an end a few days earlier, were snoring in a calm sleep. Meanwhile, on the heights of Istanbul near Hagia Sophia, a highly secret activity was taking place in the palatial central police station. Groups of Armenians had just been arrested in the suburbs and neighborhoods of the capital. Blood-colored military buses were now transporting them to the central prison. Weeks earlier, Bedri, chief of police in Constantinople, had sent official sealed orders to all the guardhouses with the instructions that they not be opened until the designated day and that they be carried out with precision. The orders were warrants to arrest the Armenians whose names were on the blacklist, a list compiled with the help of Armenian traitors. My uncle was never weak or soft on Armenians. He critiqued them as much as possible. Armenian traitors, particularly Arten Megerditsyan, who worked with the neighborhood Ittihad clubs. Condemned to death were Armenians who were prominent and active in either revolutionary or nonpartisan Armenian organizations and who were deemed liable to incite revolution or resistance. On this Saturday night, I, along with 8 other friends from Scutari, was transported by a small steamboat from the quay of the huge armory of Selimiye to Sirkaja. The night smelled of death, the sea was rough, and our hearts were full of terror. We were prisoners under strict police guard, not allowed to speak to each other, and we had no idea where we were going. We arrived at the central prison, and here behind gigantic walls and large bolted gates, they put us in a wooden pavilion in the courtyard, which was said by some to have once served as a school. We sat there quiet and somber on the bare wooden floor under the faint light of a flickering lantern, too stunned and confused to make sense of what was happening. So let me start with a very fundamental question to Ronald Suni. What happened to Armenian intellectuals and cultural leaders in 1915, and what role did that play in the unfolding plan to eradicate the Armenian population of Turkey?
Thank you, Peter. The events of 1915, which we are going to be thinking about tonight, unfolded in a series of collections of groups of people, the most dramatic of which was on the evening of April 24th, 1915. But even before the arrests of that night, already in Eastern Anatolia, what we would call historic Armenia, there was fighting, there were massacres, and there were already people being rounded up. Many people don't know that some tens of thousands of Armenian young men had been mobilized thanks to Armenian church and Armenian political parties, and became members, soldiers in uniform of the Ottoman army. And those young men fought, and some died, in the early campaigns on the Eastern Front against Russia. But late February, early March 1915, the central government, the Young Turks of the Ottoman Empire, decided to demobilize these young Armenians, take away their uniforms and their weapons, and turn them into labor battalions, amele tabular in Turkish, and eventually to murder them. The ostensible reason for that was that the Young Turks had convinced themselves, or at least told themselves, that these Armenians were traitors. They were collaborating with the Russians on the other side. Indeed, there were Armenians, Russian Armenians, largely fighting on the Russian side. And after the great Battle of Sarıkamış in January and February, December and January of 1914-1915, which the Turks lost thanks to the poor generalship of Enver Pasha, the Turks decided to blame the Armenians for that defeat and took it out on these former soldiers. Cutting down these young men who were easily marked, easily segregated, and then murdered, meant that the muscle of the Armenian nation had been eliminated. Shortly after this, in the city of Van, near the border with Iran, a city, by the way, in which Armenians constituted one of the few places in the Ottoman Empire, a majority of the population, the people there, the Armenians, defended themselves against the encroaching massacres coming ever closer to the city. That event was considered by Constantinople, by Istanbul, to be an insurrection and was the excuse for the arrest that evening of April 24th of the hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, writers, the composer Gomitas, and politicians, party leaders, indeed members of parliament, like Grigor Zorab, who had been friends with Talat Pasha, the architect of the genocide, and indeed had been playing cards with him at a European club the evening before. Those people were taken out of the city. Most of them would perish. A few, like Balakian and Gomitas, and others would survive, but most of them were destroyed. Thus, having eliminated the muscle of the Armenian nation, the Young Turks destroyed the brain of the nation, making it impossible for Armenians to organize any kind of serious defense or coordinate among the various centers. The genocide went on then. Thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children were rounded up, driven through the valleys and mountains of eastern Anatolia into the deserts of Syria, into Raqqa and Del Zor. That is, the very places where ISIS is today, which were considered uninhabitable by the Young Turks. And there, they were massacred again in the winter of 1915 and early 1916. The genocide itself can be considered a gendered genocide. First, it was the men who were eliminated, the soldiers, the intellectuals, the leaders of various communities. A whole nation's elite was taken away. And then women and children were removed, old people. Many of the women and children were then assimilated into Islamic families, either as concubines, slaves, or members of the family. So the genocide has three different prongs, three different angles to it. One is dispersion of the Armenians, so they can no longer constitute anywhere a group of more than 5%. They cannot become a nation again. Dispersion, deportation. The second was physical murder. That is the killing by the Teşkilat-i Mahsusa, the special expedition, by local Kurds, Circassians, and Chechens, under the eyes of the Ottoman and German army. And the third was this forced assimilation and Islamization, which means that today, of those hundreds of thousands of women and children who somehow survived as Muslims, there are indeed millions of people today, Turks, Kurds, and Arabs, who have Armenian ancestry, another form in which the nation has survived.
Thank you, Ron. I'm inclined to ask Nancy.
Okay. Come up here?
Yeah, up here. Thanks.
Zabel Hussein was a pioneering writer and women's rights advocate, author of many works of fiction and nonfiction, including her groundbreaking book about the Adana massacres of 1909, Among the Ruins. She was a formative part of Armenian literary modernism and died in the Stalinist purges in 1943. This is from Among the Ruins. It is not the charred houses or the devastated gardens that seem past saving and past remedying in this boundless catastrophe, nor is it the large numbers of the dying. It is rather that crippling inner feeling drifting through everyone's eyes, a feeling of misery, of despondency. It is the feeling of a people that has been trampled underfoot, ground to dust under the souls of brutes. The heads that, thirsting for light and freedom, had for a moment been lifted in human dignity, have now been smashed with ruthless cruelty. Tortured by this thought, I look out at the destroyed city, whose heaps of charred rubble now take on a different and terrible meaning. And yet, amidst this deathly desolation and despair, a smile of hope blooms. In the ruins, a group of women has taken refuge in the shade of the half-standing walls. Suspended between one wall and another, a cradle is gently rocking. Who knows? What the violence of our grief represents as impossible is perhaps possible, after all, for the people's untiring, unconscious genius for rebirth. For that wretched child's humble cradle, indifferent to the immense general calamity and quick with an invincible instinct for life, is rocking above this vast cemetery.
Adam Yarjanian went by the name Siamanto. He was one of the greatest poets in Armenia around this time, among Armenians. He was born in 1878, and as a young man, he was shocked by the massacres. He was hearing about the Hamidian massacres of the 1890s, and like many Armenians, Armenian men of this time, he was moving in and out of the country. In 1909, after another series of massacres, he wrote a group of poems called Bloody News from My Friend, which actually Peter translated with Nevart Yaklian. And then he was also caught up in the arrests in 1915 and died, murdered by the Turks. This is probably his best known work of this group. It's called The Dance, and this is from about 1909. In a field of cinders where Armenian life was still dying, a German woman, trying not to cry, told me the horror she witnessed. This thing I'm telling you about, I saw with my own eyes. Behind my window of hell, I clenched my teeth and watched the town of Bardes turn into a heap of ashes. The corpses were piled high as trees, and from the springs, from the streams and the road, the blood was a stubborn murmur and still calls revenge in my ear. Don't be afraid. I must tell you what I saw, so people will understand the crimes men do to men. For 2 days, by the road to the graveyard, let the hearts of the world understand it was Sunday morning, the first useless Sunday dawning on the corpses. From dawn to dusk, I had been in my room with a stabbed woman, my tears wetting her death, when I heard from afar a dark crowd standing in a vineyard, lashing 20 brides and singing filthy songs. Leaving the half-dead girl on the straw mattress, I went to the balcony of my window, and the crowd seemed to thicken like a clump of trees. An animal of a man shouted, "You must dance, dance when our drum beats." With fury, whips cracked on the flesh of these women. Hand in hand, the brides began their circle dance. Now, I envied my wounded neighbor, because with a calm snore, she cursed the universe and gave up her soul to the stars. Dance, they raved, dance till you die, infidel beauties. With your flapping tits, dance. Smile for us, you're abandoned now. You're naked slaves, so dance like a bunch of fucking sluts. We're hot for your dead bodies. 20 graceful brides collapsed. Get up, the crowd screamed, brandishing their swords. Then someone brought a jug of kerosene. Human justice, I spit in your face. The brides were anointed. Dance, they thundered. Here's a fragrance you can't get in Arabia. With a torch, they set the naked brides on fire, and the charred bodies rolled and tumbled to their deaths. I slammed my shutters, sat down next to my dead girl, and asked, how can I dig out my eyes?
The idea that the killing of 82 Armenian writers and intellectuals in 1915 is perhaps at the beginning of the 20th century's authoritarian assault on intellectuals is part of what we're kind of reflecting on and thinking about tonight. And so I want to ask Robert Lifton to reflect on why writers matter. What role do they play in any given culture for any given community or society?
Thanks, Peter. Since you compared our panel to a jazz ensemble with its improvisations, I'll do that, and I'll start by telling a story. I do that as a once mediocre clarinetist who can respond to that call. In October 1990, I was quite surprised to receive a letter from an unlikely correspondent, the then Turkish ambassador to the United States, Nuzhet Kandemir. And I was even more surprised by the content, in which I was chastised for references in my book, The Nazi Doctors, which had been published 4 years earlier, references to what he spoke of as, quotes, the so-called Armenian genocide allegedly perpetrated by the Ottoman Turks during the First World War, and went on to say that what really occurred was, his words, a tragic civil war initiated by Armenian nationalists. He instructed me to make appropriate changes to correct my mistakes in future editions of my book on Nazi doctors. Another surprise were two enclosures, in-house documents, one of which a draft of the ambassador's letter prepared by an American assistant, a PhD working for the Turkish government named Heath Lowry, and the second, a memo saying Ankara should have gotten onto this. They wanted to really nip truth in the bud. They didn't call it that way, that's my term, by getting to the earliest historians of the Armenian genocide, which they had failed to do, saying that Lifton was simply the end of a chain, which indeed I was. So Lowry was advising the Turkish ambassador on how better to deny the genocide. This was part, Lowry was awarded for his troubles with a chair at Princeton in Turkish studies. This is part of a project on the part of the Turkish government to fund chairs. We could call them professorships of denial throughout the American scene. Mostly the project was uncovered partly by what happened here, and it has not been entirely innocuous, but it's been far from successful as well. I immediately composed a nasty reply in my mind. I would tell this guy off and raise the question of whether an ambassador didn't have better things to do with his time than falsify history. But I got a better idea, and it's, you know, the intellectual's weapon, words of truth. So I got together with a couple of friends, authorities on genocide, one of them a particular, Roger Smith, an authority particularly on the Armenian genocide and on the denial of the Armenian genocide. And we wrote a paper called Professional Ethics and the Denial of the Armenian Genocide, which we published in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Journal of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where it could get a lot of attention. Again, the response we received confirmed the simple principle we should never forget: words do matter. So I'm introducing in this way what could be called third-party intellectuals, whom the Turks or any deniers of any genocide seek to suppress in suppressing the truths of history. If we return to the Armenian intellectuals who were killed that night, it is part of, as Peter put it, what Raphael Lemkin called cultural genocide. He was insistent on the significance of wiping out a whole people, but also wiping out what we would call their institutions and rituals that constitute a culture. I would emphasize that we are meaning-hungry creatures. We are symbolizers. We never receive anything nakedly. Anything we perceive, we recreate in this wonderful and dangerous gray matter of the human brain. The key symbolizers in any culture are artists, writers, professionals, people who deal with words and images. And such symbolizers live out, continue the cultural traditions, but also are critics of those meaning structures that constitute a culture. When they are destroyed, what is being destroyed are not only a group of human beings, but a whole imaginative constellation that's so crucial for any culture. And really what results is a culture drained of its psychological and spiritual strength, or at least of much of it, and with a wound to their creative energies of a culture. And that in turn causes considerable suffering on the part of many people who require those cultural symbols. Just a word about the perpetrators and the intellectuals and the professionals among perpetrators. I studied Nazi doctors, perhaps the worst violation of anything close to a professional ethic that has occurred in human history. But there are also lawyers, filmmakers, novelists, musicians, who serve, and engineers, who serve the Nazi genocide. In my work on genocide, I came to the conclusion that intellectuals and professionals are crucial to carrying out the genocide, to formulating its rationale, and to writing and words and images that can ennoble the genocidal project. But there are always those, and often among the descendants of the perpetrators, who take as their survivor mission, confronting historical truths, precisely those that were ignored or denied by their forebears. And you know, we know of some truly heroic Turkish voices, including Taner Akçay, one of the great historians of the Armenian Genocide, and Ragip Zarakan, who's right here next to me. And such people are crucial if we're to come to terms with genocide. Returning finally to the Turkish ambassador and his letter, since I'm neither a Turk nor an Armenian, one can view this as an attack on outside intellectuals who seek to engage the genocidal truth. The point is, none of us are, however outside intellectuals we may seem to be, we are not outside. We all live on this planet, and any kind of mass killing and genocide is a rent in the structure of the human habitat and the human species. So when genocide in this way is denied, when people who tell the truth are killed, there is an effort to contribute to a false historical consciousness, send a message that murderers did not really murder, that victims were not really killed, and thereby support a deadly psycho-historical dynamic in which unopposed genocide begets new genocide. There's no doubt about that. So combating precisely this kind of falsification and doing so in the memory of those who struggled for truth is what this panel is about and what we here should always be about.
Robert, thank you. There's so much to chew on here, and I think I'm going to take the approach that we're going to circle back to questions, both from Ron, who gave us so much context to dig into, and Robert, for your meditation on denialism and intellectual witness and truth. Let's come back to those questions, and also with the audience, and go to two readings for this little interlude here. Ron doing Gostan Zaryan and Maureen on Daniel Varusian.
Rostan Zaryan, who lived from 1885 to 1969, in some ways encapsulates the whole experience, the whole odyssey of the Armenians in the 20th century. He was born in the Russian Empire, in what is now Azerbaijan. He was a member of the literary elite in Istanbul in 1915 and somehow escaped the fate of many of his compatriots. He lived abroad in the diaspora. Eventually, he went on several occasions to Soviet Armenia and settled there, writing novels and poems, and the book from which I'm going to read, The Traveler and His Road. Monotonous days. The struggle for existence, from one school to another. I sell a little knowledge for a piece of bread. It's terrible to be a writer and belong to a small nation. It's even worse to be an Armenian writer. Our generation has more friends in the next world than in this one. There are places where I walk with anguish, as if I were crossing a graveyard of memories. I want to understand the city. I come home filled with impressions and ideas. My brain is like a swallow who has just returned to its nest. They're all dead and gone now. How did they die? No one knows, yet we know deep in our hearts where everything happens. I shiver when I think about the manner of their death. How did Siamanto die? He who was so afraid of death and so much in love with life. And Varusian, Artashes Harutyunyan, Geram Parsigyan.
Daniel Varusian was born in 1884 and died in 1915. He was a leading Armenian poet of Armenian literary modernism and a founder of the Mehyan movement. His final poems, which were written during his deportation and imprisonment, celebrated Armenian agrarian life. They were confiscated by the Turkish gendarmes, but later retrieved and published as Songs of Bread in 1921. The description of his murder can be found in Balakian's Armenian Golgotha. Coming home. We're coming home tonight, singing together, coming home by white moonlight. Oh, village houses, oh, you village houses, wake up all the dogs in all the yards, wake up all the wells and fountains, and let them bubble up to fill our pitchers. We brought home flowers, flowers for the holidays, and we're singing. We come singing of love. We're coming by the mountain road. Houses, oh you houses, open the gates. Now as the oxen horns push them in, let the oven smoke rise to mingle with the blue smoke of the roofs. And you young wives of the houses, you shy harse with the new baby boys, bring milk in blue, clay pitchers, we're coming home.
So as one thinks about the events of 1915, one also thinks about its implications for the legacy decades in Turkey. I mean, how did the killing of Armenian intellectuals in 1915 reverberate in Turkey? What are the situations today for intellectual freedom and the lives of writers in Turkey 10 decades later? So Ragip Zarakolu and Maureen Freely, I throw this out to you. And you've read Maureen and Ragip's bio in the program, so you understand their immersion in Turkish culture and society. Ragip. You want to talk from there? Okay, sure.
poets, arrest the intellectuals, lynch the righteous people. It became, unfortunately, a tradition, state tradition. There is a definition of that kind of state by Yves Ternon, l'état criminel. If there is no punishment for the crimes against the humanity, the crimes can go on forever. The experience of the Armenian intelligentsia in 1915 to be arrested first as hostage, later massacred, became a tradition of Turkish state against all kind dissident voices, all kind different identities. Sure, not at the same level like Armenian genocide, but it became a model. For example, in 1925, there was a mass arresting of journalists and writers and poets, and they were sent to Diyarbakir, Dikranekert. And then I remember Zohrab, the brilliant brain of Armenian intelligentsia, a writer, an academics, a human rights defender. He was arrested and he was killed also on the way of Diyarbakir. Who killed Zohrab? A Turkish young Turk officer named Cherkez Ahmed. He was a part of deep state special organization. Before Zohrab, he had other killings. For example, in 2010, he began his career by killing dissident Turkish journalists. And Zohrab could escape because he was a friend of young Turk intelligence circles, and they helped in 1909 to save their lives from the reactionary rebellion in Istanbul. The Armenian intellectuals saved them, and this was a different kind of thanks might be. And Zohrab could escape. He wasn't arrested in April. He was arrested at the end of May. And last day, he was with Talat in Circle d'Orient in Grand Avenue de Pera. They play tawla, and then Zohrab went house, and by night, as several happened to us later years, police was waiting him. And we never learned what was the last talk between Talat and Zohrab. Zohrab didn't escape because until the last moment he tried to save hostage arrested Armenian intellectuals. But the killing, this decision about the Zohrab was a sign of the beginning of the genocide. And just after, in June, they hang Armenian revolutionaries who were a part of the resistance of the junta dictatorship government of the Itat party. And in June, all were killed in June. Rupen Sevak, Siamento, Daniel Varusian, Diran Kalegian, and several journalists and academicians. So-called, they were on the way of trial were to Diyarbakir. Who was the mayor, the governor of Diyarbakir? Dr. Reşit Bey. We talk about the Nazi doctors, but interesting role of the doctors, all they were social Darwinists. They were the cruel character, intellectual characters of Armenian genocide. Dr. Nazım Bey, he was one of the organizers, or other names. So it was a very cool, organized annihilation, exterminism, example of exterminism of the state. And there was no need to arrest Armenian intellectuals, because if we could understand, could be afraid because of the Dardanelles, but they win 18 March, Dardanelles victory. It was a German and Ottoman common victory. And just after they win the victory, they could planned annihilation of a nation. And in June, also the date of beginning of the mass deportation and massacres. So it is the same date. The June was the terrible decision time to annihilation a people all together. That time also the time of beginning to kill Armenian soldiers in Ottoman army. They accepted their citizenship responsibility, went to the army, and they were massacred also. This is the beginning of exterminist state in Turkey. And after, with the different circles, per nearly 10 years, there was operations against the intellectuals, dissidents, and it went on until today. And because of this, exterminism is to be a kind of freedom to crime. If there is an impunity, so the crimes could go on. Also, it is the same for the crimes against the humanity. So, it is strategically very important for Turkey to be a real, safe, democratic country with the Armenian genocide. It is the beginning of the evil, it is the beginning of the hell. And hell went until today with denialism, supported by national security policies of Turkish Republic, and it is going on now today. Thank you.
Turkey is not a person, but Turkey in newspapers and particularly on the BBC is always described as a person who's denying, yes? And the people in Turkey will often say, oh, we never knew anything about this. But the secret is there for all of us to see all the time, and it affects everything that happens in Istanbul, the city where I grew up. I went to school with grandchildren of Enver Pasha, Cemal Pasha, and Dr. Nazim. I didn't know that at the time this has come out. I also went to school with, I never liked Hugh Lowry. He used to always come to dinner and I didn't like him, but you can tell him actually. And I also went to school with the generation of historians who have opened up the dialogue between Turkish historians and Armenian and American and European historians. One of the most courageous of my former classmates, her family made its fortune manufacturing Turkish flags. All right? So it is everywhere, and it is absolutely at the center. You know, the lie, the genocide that was denied. There is, following on from Ragib's true words, I will affirm again, there is no intellectual freedom in Turkey. There is an official history which all school children must learn, and any deviation from that is severely punished. So because it's a country in which we have heard that there are millions of Turks who have descended from Islamicized Armenians, you have the secret story in the family, and then you have this official history, and then you have the horrible tension that somebody must carry these two histories, one that cannot be spoken and one that must be memorized. But because I'm a generation of 1968, freedoms aren't given, they're taken, yeah? Okay. And in Turkey, there's a very, very, very strong tradition amongst writers of resistance. Writers, publishers, activists working all together. For many of the decades of the 20th century, the Armenian Genocide was not on the agenda. That began to change in the 1980s because of our friend here, who was the first to publish translations of the great works with our dear friend Hrant Dink in the, what was it, 1984, when he had the bookstore, yes, Hrant Dink, yeah, and so they published them together, and also had very, very clever ways of distributing the books because it wasn't possible to put them into bookstores at the time. I would like to say a few words about Hrant Dink, who should be much better known and who is continues to be a very, very important person in Turkey. He was the person who brought the question of the Armenian Genocide into the public space in Turkey, who appealed to the conscience or to people of conscience. He almost single-handedly educated the intelligentsia about this, people who claimed that they had never heard about this, and he did it in a very, very open-hearted, loving, compassionate way. When he was finally allowed to have a passport, he made the first real connections with the Armenians of Armenia and the diaspora. And for his efforts, he was murdered in 2007. But he continues to inspire the groups that he formed around him and younger people in generations, particularly what we call the Gezi generation now, the protests 2 years ago. And also that he's given courage to the millions who of Turks who are descended from Islamicized Armenians. What I want to finish by saying is that for those of us who are Turkish or who have lived in Turkey, it is a question, a very deep, deep question of conscience. And as Ragib said, until that question is answered and completely embraced openly, there's no hope for the peoples of Turkey. There are many books that have been written to open up this subject. I've had the good fortune to be able to translate some of them. And again, it's the words that will survive. The books that I've translated will not sell very much, but they will be in the libraries, and they'll be there for other people to find in 100 years, I hope.
again, we'll circle back to many of the rich implications of these responses shortly. My last question here to Eric and Nancy points to the impact of the loss of the Armenian writers and intellectuals of 1915 and or the legacy in Armenian culture in any ways that you might see it. What was continued, what was lost, how did it play out?
Well, I'd like to set the stage a little bit before directly answering that question for those people who aren't particularly familiar with the relationship between the Armenians and the Muslim Ottomans just prior to the war, because there was a lot of tension, particularly in the east, in the more the outback of the empire. People come away kind of thinking that this is something that was just constant. There was all this tension between these groups, but in fact, Armenians were a very important part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. If you today go to visit Istanbul, as you come into the city, the first thing you will see as you look up from the Bosphorus are the magnificent mosques, particularly the one Suleiman and his families built. And those mosques, built about 500 years ago, were all designed by an Armenian, Sinan. He later became Muslim as part of the court, but it's just important to understand that the Armenian people were very integrated into the culture. The first modern theater in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, was founded by an Armenian. And so this literary scene, particularly in Constantinople, which considered itself pretty much to be a European city, it was a European, I mean, half of the city is in Europe, and much of the Ottoman Empire had been in Europe. These writers and these poets and journalists, they thought in that way. They were cosmopolitan people, and many of them had been educated in other countries, were influenced by French writers or Russians, and they're very sophisticated work. The modernist texture was very much a part of what was happening. It could manifest itself in different ways, in realism or in symbolism. I've found a lot of the Armenian work that I read is very lyrical, dense, but they were very, very contemporary writers. And because, the reason I'm prefacing with this is because when the arrests happened in April of 1915, there were some, Zorab definitely saw it coming, but many people were just going about their business and really could not have imagined something like this happening. So you have to sort of set the stage and imagine, a scene, just like our scene here in New York. I get called down to the local precinct station, and oh, gee, there's John Guare is there, and Ed Albee is there, or I don't know, Stephen Gerges is there. It's like, what are you doing here? Well, I don't know, I had some ticket, I have to, and the next thing you know, we're being rounded up, and precinct by precinct, the people are being collected and taken to these central prisons, where they are there for a couple of days, and then moved off into the hinterlands, where most of them are murdered. I mean, this is a very intense shock to a network of people, some of whom were away at the time and may have just survived just because they happened to be in Paris at that moment, or in the United States or wherever. Then this is followed, whatever that was, and believe me, people were not able to really get a sense of really what was happening until well after it was done. Then the full genocide blooms over the next couple of years, and it is only really until after the war that people fully, really, really understand that everyone is gone. The entire Christian population is gone. There either been entire, in the case of Erzincan, 25,000 Armenians lived in that city. They were all killed. People were just moved out into deportation caravans, or in smaller villages, the soldiers or the chetes would just show up and just kill everybody on the spot. So I just want to point out that as a community, the shock was intense. And so there were two, I believe, and I haven't like made a study of this, but I know something about it. There were two aspects. First of all, vast numbers of members of this artistic community were just gone. And that means they were murdered. So that means that their legacy could not continue, their protégés would never be, they couldn't reach maturity if they were, let's say, you know, middle-aged or younger artists. It just stops, gets cut off in that way. And secondly, those who did survive, and I think this is a very important part of this genocide, is the trauma and suffering of the people who witnessed what happened and then lived on all the way for decades later. And we don't have to be talking about artists here, we're just talking about anybody who was there witnessing these horrors. The level of sadism and violence cannot be overemphasized. It was mind-blowing. It was as if people were trying to think of how could they do the most cruel things to the most people, including children. And anyone who was there and survived was scarred forever. So you have that aspect of it too. Now you have a group of artists who identify themselves as writers or poets or whatever, grappling, how do I say something about this? One of the things about the Armenians is that we as a community, many people chose to just say nothing. Most of my grandparents were that way. They just didn't, there was like a silence. It was a pact of silence. It was too horrible to discuss. And I'm sure that was part of what happened with the artist community. Or they would try to write about it, and how do you write about this? It was overwhelming. So you will find work that is intensely lyrical in an attempt to somehow try and grab it. I see a parallel with what happened here to us. I mean, it's of course different, but what happened with us with AIDS in the 1980s and 90s. Generation just cut short, and those who survived were traumatized by the very fact that they survived, and then wanted to address it and really couldn't. And, or in some, I mean, barely successful in certain cases. So I would leave you with that image of what happens. And then, as was said earlier a couple of times, the artistic part of our society is our conscience, is our glue. And so what does that do to us as a group?
So I'm going to go back to Zabel Hussein and her legacy. Zabel Hussein, Ottoman Armenian author, educator, and women's rights advocate, was the only woman on the blacklist of Armenian notables slated for roundup in Constantinople on April 24th, 1915. She managed to evade arrest, making her way first to Bulgaria, later traveling to do relief work among Armenian survivors in the Caucasus. In 1919, she was reunited with her family in Paris and eventually migrated to Soviet Armenia, where she continued writing and teaching until she was caught up in the Stalinist purges of 1936 to 1937. Arrested on trumped-up charges of subversion, she was sent to a labor camp where it is believed she died in 1943. The Armenian Patriarchate commissioned one of her most famous works, the one I read from earlier, Among the Ruins, in the aftermath of the 1909 Adana massacres, which were a foreshadowing of the larger tragedy looming ahead of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. Over 20,000 Armenians were slaughtered in the province of Adana in April of 1909. According to family lore, my paternal grandfather, who was born in Adana city,
survived this bloodbath because he was employed by the Berlin-Baghdad Railway Project and wrapped himself in the German flag on his way to and from work. Yeseyan's book-length account of the scene in Adana after the massacres is at once harrowing and poetic. This brief excerpt is from the day she arrives by sea to the port of Mersin, which incidentally was the city of my grandmother's birth and from whence my grandmother's family was deported in 1915. All day, it was as if I was seeing everything through a nightmare. There were women dressed in black, the family members of the first victims, and cries and laments of the wounded, the orphans, and the widows whose grief was reignited upon seeing us. The following day, we would go to Adana and be amid the ruins. I thought senselessly about it and spent another sleepless night with my heart racing, tending to my sorrow. The night was cool, moisture rose from the sprawling sea and soared over the sleeping city. The roar of the waves soothed me as caravans of slow-moving camels passed endlessly through the street, their undulating movements marked by the sound of ringing bells. In addition to her lifetime of work on behalf of the Armenian people, Yeseyan was an anti-war advocate whose concern was not merely nationalist, but rather universal. She was the model of the engaged writer whose work and life resonate powerfully today. In her spirit, I close my remarks with a brief text that I hope does honor to her legacy. It is entitled, Letter to Palestine with Armenian Proverbs. In a foreign place, the exile has no face. You wake up in the morning and forget where you are, the smell of coffee from the kitchen, the sound of slippers across the linoleum floor. It could be any country. When you look in the mirror, you see the eyes of your grandfather. He expects something from you, but he won't tell you what. Better to go into captivity with the whole village than to go to a wedding alone. The fabric was torn. With scraps you have made a tent, you have fashioned a kite, you have sewn a dress, you have wrapped yourself in a flag. They have separated you with gun, grenade, barbed wire, wall, prison, passport. They have underestimated your will. The hungry dream of bread, the thirsty of water. Passing from one village to the next without obstacle, without document, without your heart thumping up near your throat. Turning the key in the lock, you enter through a door you have never passed through before, except in your grandmother's stories and in your dreams.
Nancy and Eric, that's so much rich layers here to respond to, and now I'm truly frustrated with the parameters of the evening, and I'm wondering if the good people who are running the theater would let us stay for another hour. Is that possible? Megan, are you here? Are we really?
I hope it's here.
All right, we do have parameters of time. So here's my thought. I mean, there's so much to respond to, and we could have a very intricate conversation, but you want to, I think, also have a conversation in relation to the many issues raised.
Peter, can we read our Turkish poem?
Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah.
Well,
Very
here's
short.
my idea.
Okay.
Do you want to read the poems now, or do you want to close
Okay.
with the two poems, Robert?
Was born in 1878, died in 1945. A formalist poet and public voice, he was a leading figure of the Armenian modernist revival. He escaped execution in 1915 because he was traveling in the Egypt of the time. His poems helped define a perspective on the Armenian diaspora. And this poem, which I especially like because it has a pained glimmer of hope at the end, a short poem called The Country of Dust. Small, miniaturized, yet you insist on shaking your canyons and cliffs with huge spasms, as if you were the center of the earth and the magnet that draws out and fills every sea. So small, a corner, not even a corner, scattered points, dispersed and dispersing lines of fallen walls, walls you imagine the palace you once raised from the mantle of dust. How can you dream of old architecture today when every edifice caves in to make way for new shapes? Any shock can erase you forever, and no eye will even blink. Yours alone the concern. But hope rises like the sun. Accumulate. Dust consolidates into stone.
I want to read first in Turkish Nazım Hikmet's poem. He was in prison 13 years. Sandaleta is the form and poem. Wife, his wife. Bakkal Karabet'in ışıkları yanmış. Affetmedi bu Ermeni vatandaş. Kürt dağlarında babasının kesilmesini. Fakat seviyor seni. Çünkü sen de affetmedin bu karayı sürenleri Türk halkının alnına. Nazım Hikmet. And I want to go on with another poem. He is Bedrettin Aykın. He is the only Turkish poet, as I know, wrote directly on genocide. His mother was Armenian, survival orphaned. I will read in Turkish and Marin. Marvelous. Translated in short time. Uzaklaşıyor herkes çevremden. Yaşam uzaklaşıyor, yetişemiyorum. Sesler kesildi, ışık söndü. Güneş de ışıtmıyor artık. Ömrün buzul çağı bu. Üşüyorum, çok üşüyorum. Neredesin anneciğim? Ört üstüme.
They have all left my side. My life grows distant beyond my grasp. Voices fade, lights go out. The sun no longer heats me. This is the age of ice. I am cold, so cold. Where are you, my dear mother? Mother, wrap me up warm. Thank you.
There is so much to take in. And I think maybe the best way to start that process is with you, who want to talk about any of these issues. So the mic is there. If you want a question, the mic is there. Please.
I have a question for the panelists of Armenian descent who are somehow the inheritors of the legacy of the dark paradigm. I wanted to ask you, in this centennial year when you probably have spent a lot of time telling the stories you told us today, what the impact is on you
take a couple questions at once, and then
I have a question for Dr. Lifton. Thank you for as usual. The goal of all art is to seek the truth, and the truth is incontrovertible. You addressed the denial issue, and could you comment on whether the Armenian nation or individuals per se can get over this trauma that's inherited over time, over generations? There's enough data to support that. Can the Armenian nation get through this denial, the current generation, without the recognition, acknowledgement by the current Turkish government?
My answer to that is it's not either or. Armenians suffer from the failure of Turks to acknowledge what they have been through. In my work on genocide, I have found that survivors become what has been called collectors of justice. For instance, in the Nazi genocide of Jews, there was deep disappointment when Josef Mengele, a notorious doctor, was found dead from having drowned. And not that what was sought was complete revenge, but what was sought was acknowledgement, confrontation, his being put on the dock to be himself confronted with what he had done. And that's my sense of what Armenians yearn for. I think in a way, even this year and the last few years, because if one follows the situation, consciousness and awareness has been increasing. And it even moves from what I call scattered to formed awareness, fragmentary awareness, or fragment awareness is just images, but formed awareness becomes realization of what happened. And that is taking hold throughout the world. It doesn't mean that Armenians can recover fully from the trauma we're talking about, but it helps in that healing process. And what I'd say is that the healing never reaches a Zen moment of Satori where it's achieved. It is a process. It goes on, and there are ebbs and flows and hurts and satisfactions. And much of those satisfactions are really the experience and recognition of truth.
Yeah, so I'm going to address the question that was here about, what it's like as a, grandchild, family member of a survivor to be in this period where there's so much focus on the genocide. And one of the things that I did this year, just last month, was go with a group called Project 2015, where we organized 170 Armenians from around the world, from 20 countries, to go to Istanbul. And we went at the invitation of some Turkish civil society groups so that we could actually be in Istanbul for the 100th, the Centennial commemorations. And it was a very, very, super intense, very fruitful, amazing place to be, meeting all these people, Turks and Kurds and Assyrians and all the human rights groups, human rights activists, intellectuals, artists, with whom we have a common understanding of the history. And I know there are a very small number of, very small percentage of the people in Turkey who think this way, but it was very profound and moving to be with them, on the Centennial. And that, for me, I just wrote a piece that's in the Armenian Weekly magazine, where I was talking about this idea of co-resistance, where you get together with other people, like-minded people, to resist denial, to resist erasure, to resist, falsified history. And that was really very important to me. It was also, I'll tell one brief anecdote. We were in front of the French consulate for the evening commemoration. There were a bunch of different locations that we went to through the day, doing different commemorative activities, and we were there in the evening. And as people were gathering, unbeknownst to us, we didn't know what was going on, but all of a sudden we heard this chanting, and we'd been told by the police that we couldn't be on Taksim Square, we had to be at the top of Istiklal Street because it was the only place the police could secure. And so a little way away from us, they had set up a line to keep right-wing counter-protesters from approaching us. So at one point we were there and all of a sudden heard this chanting, and we couldn't hear what the chanting was, but we could hear it coming towards us. And I asked the Turkish woman who was standing there, I said, "What is that?" And she said, "It's the right-wingers." And I had this moment of complete panic, grief. I started crying, we all started crying, because, and the Turkish woman said, don't worry, they won't be able to hurt you. Nothing's gonna happen to you. And I didn't even think they could actually get through the police line, but it was this idea somehow of this like wave of hatred that was trying to approach us, which is like absolutely terrifying. And then Arsene Kanjan, who's married to Adam Goyen, who's this very fiery, she's like, "Where are they? I'm going." And I was like grabbing her, I was like, "Arsene, don't go!" Like, and then she was running towards, and then she said, "They're with us." And it was these young Armenians from the Gezi movement. Nor Zartank is the movement, and they had organized a 1,000-person contingent of all these young people, radical young people, and they were carrying signs that said in Armenian, "Menk Hosink," which means "we are here." So then when we saw them, we all started crying again. And it was like a super intense, powerful experience, so.
So years ago, I was about to give a lecture on the genocide to an audience, Armenian audience, in the San Fernando Valley outside of LA. And a very prominent scholar said, "Ron, I know you're going to talk about genocide, but can you be upbeat about it?" Now, I think, in a way, to answer this question, and listening to Nancy's account, I think we can be upbeat about it. First of all, the denialists are increasingly marginalized. They are now a fringe element. They're there, they're persistent, but they're increasingly nutty and isolated. And overwhelmingly, scholars, the New York Times, and others have come out, and no one says alleged genocide. Serious people say alleged genocide. They say genocide. The recognition campaign has gone on and been incredibly successful. The Pope has recognized the genocide. The European Parliament has. Okay, so the United States, Israel, and a few other countries have not recognized it officially, but it's now become something that even in Turkey, a very active, progressive intelligentsia, which appears in the media, constantly is bringing up this issue. Very importantly, the Kurdish population, some dozens of millions of people, recognize the genocide and see themselves as allied with the Armenians. So new voices are heard, and I would say over these 10 years, I'm undepressed. I am more and more enthusiastic. I'll tell one short story. A friend of mine, Halil Berktay, a very progressive Turkish intellectual, I asked him, I said, "Halil Bey, has there been progress on this issue?" He says, "Oh yes, Ron, oh yes. I get far less death threats now than I used to."
So I'm going to add to Ron and Nancy's sequence here, if I may. I'll be as succinct as I can, but it really hooks into the flow of narrative. In October, I went with a group of American writers from the Iowa Writers International Workshop, and Maureen, although not an Iowa writer, was with us, although I should say not an American writer, but well, you are, really, you're a cosmopolitan. Okay, so Maureen was with us. There were 5 of us, and we were hosted by the State Department. And I found myself in 2 really interesting, and I was anxious about speaking in public about the history of 1915, about genocide, and about my family's own experience and so on. But I found myself at Bozici University in a classroom talking openly about my grandmother's, my maternal grandmother's family's experience in Diyarbakir in 1915. Everybody was killed except for my grandmother and her 2 infant daughters. Her whole family was wiped out in the first week of August. And I'm sitting there thinking, am I really talking about this in this university, this prestigious, beautiful university on the banks of the Bosphorus? The next day, we all found ourselves in a very chic art gallery in the Beyoğlu section of Istanbul, reading with 3 young Turkish writers. The next day, that went well, and again, talking about Armenian genocide, reading segments from one of my books and so forth. The next day, we were hosted by the U.S. Cultural Attaché, a big gala, Sunday, a really beautiful party. People had come in from Ankara, actually Liv Shafak flew in from London. It was really quite a beautiful, energized moment. Before the evening was over, I found myself talking to 2 of the young Turkish writers. One woman broke down, crying, talking about her hidden Armenian grandmother. The other young man talked about his father's best friend in Ankara, who was an Armenian genocide survivor. Both of them were very candid and quite expansive in talking about what happened in 1915 and genocide and all of it. And I found myself in the most kind of defamiliarized place, in that I was standing in Istanbul talking with Turkish writers of a younger generation who were really digging deep into the Armenian past with a lot of candor and openness. And there was a kind of bond that was very special. So that to me suggests a lot of the hopeful energy in civil society, some of which has been noted tonight.
I would just add a note about our last day when we went to the offices of Agos, which was Frank Fink's newspaper, which was a community newspaper when he started it, and is now the voice of democratic hope, I would say. And it's if you want an analysis of anything that's going on in Turkey, that's where you go, and that's where people are speaking openly. But their lives are always at risk, but they're there and they're carrying on.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
This time has been incredibly emotional and educational for probably all of us. The most difficult thing that I've struggled with recently is trying to explain as a parent to children how it is that such atrocities can actually happen. How is it that people can be so inhumane to others? So not, with the Armenian Genocide, but with the Nazis and with others. Since you're all incredibly accomplished and great scholars and academics, is there a way that you've found, Peter, or anyone, for a relatively young person to sort of put the mindset and the evolution of how these kinds of things get momentum and get to that point to where they can actually happen? Because it's not easy to explain it to a young person.
How young? That's
Your
my first question.
Is a
Like, how
two-day
young?
seminar, so, but somebody can try to do it succinctly. That's a question for a two-day seminar, but did you go ahead?
Well, no, I
Nancy?
just had a question. Is like, how old are you talking about? Like, how young a child are you talking about having this conversation? Oh, okay. Well, that's maybe you want to do that.
I am a psychiatrist and I'm supposed to have an answer for something like this, but I'm not sure that I do. And this issue has arisen, of course, among Jewish Holocaust survivors and their children.